Good morning and welcome to Red Plains Adventist. I'm so glad you've joined us here for our Sabbath morning message. We are currently studying our way through the Sermon on the Mount, and I hope that you have been and will continue to be blessed as we learn what it means to be citizens of the kingdom of heaven. If you would like to return your tithes and offerings to one of our churches here in our district, you can do that by visiting redplainsadventist.com/giving. You can find links for online giving there, as well as addresses if you prefer to mail in. And we want you to know that you're always invited to join us for one of our church services. You can find information about them there on the website as well, times and locations. We would love to have you visit one of our church locations in Weatherford, Elk City, or Altus, whichever one is closest to you. But we are so grateful that you continue to join us here online. If you ever have any questions or would like special prayer, please feel free to reach out through one of our social channels, and I monitor those and would love to pray with you or dialogue with you if you have any questions about what we're studying together. So with that, we'll get right into our message today. Thank you for being here. God bless and happy Sabbath. Before we carry on with our study of the Sermon on the Mount, I think it's worth taking a moment to just discuss for a minute the nature and methodology of teaching in Jesus' day, how Jesus and other teachers in this time period would teach the people. See, we're products of an industrialized system of education. All of us have been through school where the main goal was to make sure that you knew certain information by a certain age. And really, most of our education has just been rote memorization. And until you get through your second or halfway through your third year of undergrad, you don't really get out of this idea that you just need to get a good baseline amount of knowledge memorized. And so for us, education is taking notes, listening to the factoids that the teacher's teaching you, and then being able to recite those factoids back exactly the way the teacher wanted you to recite them, and that's considered learning. And this is really a product of modern technology that even allows us to do this. This is all kind of based off of this process of like the assembly line. That's when education started to change, that we can just start loading you up with information and you can eventually memorize all of this stuff. But teaching in Jesus's day and up until really about the 1800s was more focused on giving a knowledge of the truth. It was more about being able to communicate in a way that brought the truth or the knowledge that you were trying to learn into a practical sphere so that it could be remembered and understood rather than just learned and memorized. And so that's why you see Jesus teaching with parables and speaking in ways so that people would remember the things that he was saying so they could relate it to their lives. People weren't sitting around with a ballpoint pen and a notepad taking notes so that they could regurgitate the specific things that Jesus said back at a later date. Jesus was interested in them being able to understand how the truth of what he was saying to them should be applicable to their lives. And so this is important when we're interpreting what we're learning here on the Sermon on the Mount, is that Jesus was not trying to give us a systematized set of doctrines. He wasn't trying to give us a list of things that we have to do. He's trying to communicate the truth of what it means to live in the kingdom of heaven in a way that those who are listening can understand its application to their life. And this is a very different process of teaching. For our modern minds, we want this objective truth statement we want to know this true thing, and we forget sometimes that just the objective truth still has to be interpreted and understood and applied to our lives. And Jesus was most concerned with how we might apply truth to our lives, not simply that we know a true statement. We can see this as an example in mathematics. Mathematics is one of those areas where a lot of how we're taught math is simple, kind of like linear statements, right? Equations that are just numbers on a page. They're completely objective. There's nothing other to know about them other than say 2 plus 1 equals 3. 2 plus 1 equals 3 is a true statement. It's a fact. It's incontrovertible. It's objective truth. If you have 2 and you add 1, it equals 3. But in math, we have to start giving these true statements some flesh on them. So we start putting them in those word problems that we all hate. And the reason we do that is because we need to start understanding how this truth relates to our life. And so we could take a word problem like Jimmy has 2 action figures and Sam has 1. Jimmy takes Sam's action figure and now he has 3. Right? So the equation would be 2 plus 1 equals 3. But that's not the whole story when we look at this problem. For Jimmy, 2 plus 1 equals 3. That's good stuff. That's a true statement for him. But that's not the whole picture for Sam. Sure, it was true that 2 plus 1 equals 3, but for Sam, 1 minus 1 also equals 0. And so we have to understand that we have to be able to interpret these teachings in a way that helps us recognize how truth affects our life. And this is what Jesus is very concerned with here in the Sermon on the Mount, is helping us to understand that we are part of the people of God. We are citizens of the kingdom of heaven, and our lives don't only affect ourselves. And especially as we begin to enter into this section of the Sermon on the Mount, we begin to see very clearly that Jesus is not just concerned with that we would know the truth and do the truth, but that we would be aware of how the objective truth as practiced in our life affects those around us. Truth has always been better communicated through application than theory, because this is what really matters. How does this truth impact my life? Now, as we go forward here, we aren't going to take these various individual sections of "you've heard it said, but I say," and work through them individually. The next 2 weeks, we're going to kind of refer to them broadly and generally and kind of pull out a couple of the big ideas as they relate to how we would be, how Jesus would have us live in the kingdom of heaven, because that's our main focus here. There's good teaching in there. There's really good statements by Jesus that when we line them up with other statements in the Bible, it helps us to understand and affirms doctrine. But we just want to take this in a very general sense, because we're approaching this as we're trying to learn what it means to live in the kingdom of heaven. And so that's how we're going to do that over the next couple of weeks. Jesus so far in the Sermon on the Mount has been saying some radical things. Primarily, that the very people that have been believed to be cursed by God have been blessed by God, and that God has taken these people who would follow after Jesus, and he has adopted them into the kingdom of heaven, and he now calls them to be representatives of this kingdom, of Jesus, of God, to the world around them. And I've painted with a pretty broad stroke as we've talked about this, and I know that for some people that might have been making you a little uncomfortable, because, well, we're a little uncomfortable with the idea that grace is this radical, that grace is this reckless. We want to feel like there's boundaries and walls that constrict us, and we won't go off into why I think that is, but it can be difficult when we're confronted with this picture of the grace of God and the love of Christ that is so broad in its application to our lives. And so some have been struggling with that and looked ahead to this next verse and felt like there was a good balancing point coming, because this is a verse that starts to really constrict things down in the way we normally apply it. Matthew chapter 5, verses 17 and 18. Jesus says at this point, "Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. For truly I say to you, until heaven and earth pass away, not an iota, not a dot will pass away from the law until all is accomplished. I can imagine for a lot of us that feels much better. Yes, the law. We must keep the law. I think that we need to understand, I don't know, doesn't it seem odd to you on the one hand that we can say over and over and over that it is our love for God that compels us to act, but at the same time we have to really work to keep the law. And if we tell people that God will work in them if they'll just follow him and love him, that he will change them, but then on the other hand we tell them you have to keep the law. It seems very, to me, antagonistic. And if the only reason you're keeping the law is because you're afraid if you don't keep the law that you won't be able to be saved, then there's something wrong with your understanding of who God is. The Ten Commandments really are a marvelous moral directive. It's universal in nature. If you can uphold the principles of the Ten Commandments, and honestly, the law, as Jesus is referring to, is not just the Ten Commandments, it's the whole Torah. If you could keep the Levitical law, you would live a life that on the outside appears to be pretty virtuous, pretty upright, a pretty good life, a pretty moral life. A moral life can be lived apart from the Spirit of Christ. There's tons of people in this world who aren't even Christians, who don't even consider themselves to believe in God, who are really great people. I know some of them. Some of the best people I know, the people who, when they tell you they're going to be somewhere, they're going to be there. If you need them, you call them on the drop of a hat, they are there. They are honest, they are upright, they are kind and loving. They sacrifice their lives, like the aspects of their lives, their money and their time to care for people, to work for the good of other people. They volunteer. They're just really good people. And if they would just go to church, like they would look like the epitome of what a Christian should be. But the problem is that if they're offended, if they get angry with someone, I've sat with them and tried to talk with them and help them to process their anger and seen them struggle with their inability to forgive, to let something pass by. They on the outside, they do all of these things, but they struggle with letting that be the reality of their heart in aspects of their life. And so even though on the outside they're doing all this self-sacrificial actions, their heart has not been softened by the Spirit of God. And that's what Jesus is most interested in. That's what he's trying to communicate to us here as we go forward, is that what it means to live in the kingdom of heaven is that you have to have a transformation of heart. The externals are not good enough to achieve the true citizenship that we are called to have in the kingdom of heaven. So Jesus here, as he makes this statement, he is affirming the fact that the law is important and the law is good. It has a purpose in our life. The law helps us to know what is right behavior, but the law is not enough to accomplish all that it's supposed to do. We see this as we look through Paul's writings, that there's a number of places where Paul helps us understand the purpose of the law and its role in our lives. In Galatians chapter 3 and verse 21, it says, "If a law had been given that could give life, then righteousness would indeed be by the law." You see, the simple keeping of the law can't offer us righteousness. If we simply don't break the law, we still do not have righteousness. The law could never do this. This long-held idea that in the Old Covenant somehow a Jew could truly become righteous by keeping the law and strict adherence to it is just a false error. It always has depended on placing your faith on something outside of yourself. the law's purpose has always been something more than for us to gain righteousness simply by keeping the law. Paul goes on in Galatians chapter 3 and verse 23 and 25, "Now before faith came, we were held captive under the law, imprisoned until the coming faith would be revealed. So then the law was our guardian until Christ came, in order that we might be justified by faith. But now that faith has come, we are no longer under a guardian." That word guardian there in some of the older translations is translated schoolmaster or teacher. The law was supposed to be our teacher, teaching us how to live until Christ came. Once Christ has come, once we have placed our faith in Jesus, then we don't need the guardian anymore. Why don't we need the guardian anymore? We'll get to that in just a minute. So the law served this purpose to kind of hold us in place, to teach us how we ought to live until we come to Christ. Romans chapter 7 and verse 1 says, "If it had not been for the law, I would not have known sin, for I would not have known what it was to covet if the law had not said, 'Thou shalt not covet.'" So the law is needed to reveal our true nature to ourselves, to help us recognize that we need Christ. But even if we keep the law to the letter, even if we do everything that it says, the law cannot offer us righteousness. Only Jesus can do that, because only Jesus has met the requirements of the law and fulfilled it. He says, "I have come to fulfill the law and the prophets." Jesus did that, and now he is able to offer us his righteousness because he has fulfilled the commandments. But that's not all that Jesus says about the law. He goes on. In Matthew chapter 5 and verse 19, he says, "Therefore, whoever relaxes one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do the same will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever does them and teaches them will be called great in the kingdom of heaven." And this is where it becomes very important for us to remember our context. Jesus is speaking to a crowd, and in this crowd are scribes and Pharisees. He's also speaking to this crowd who for years have been taught and believe, and the truth of it is that in their culture, the scribes and the Pharisees are the teachers of the law. And they were very particular about their teaching. They had very strict laws that had expanded well beyond just the Ten Commandments or just beyond the Levitical law to flower out into a huge buffer area around the central law of God so that they wouldn't even come close to breaking the law. They had been adding all of these additional requirements on to try to protect themselves from ever breaking the letter of the law. And so when Jesus is speaking here, when he says that whoever teaches others, it immediately is going to bring to their mind that he is speaking about the scribes and Pharisees. So he's making a very direct statement to how the scribes and the Pharisees have been interacting here with the people of God. And the scribes and the Pharisees, they were good at keeping the law. Sometimes we like to kind of blow it off as though, because we look back and we see that, man, they were some pretty rotten people sometimes in how they had decided they could keep the letter of the law but still treat this person so poorly. But they were keeping the law. We see multiple occasions in the Bible where it's not argued that they were not keeping the letter of the law. Paul even says of himself in Philippians chapter 3, verse 6, "As to the righteousness under the law, blameless." The Jewish leaders really did keep the letter of the law. Paul writes back and says, look, according to the letter of the law, according to the customs of the Pharisees, I was blameless. I had it all down. But what they had forgotten was that the keeping of the law was never really the purpose of the law in the first place. Bonhoeffer put it this way: "There is no fulfillment of the law apart from communion with God, and no communion with God apart from the fulfillment of the law." when God brought Israel out of Egypt and into the wilderness, he didn't bring them out there and give them the law because he wanted to give them a law to keep. He brought them out of captivity. He brought them to the wilderness to have a relationship with them. When he spoke to them to give them the law, it was never his intention that they would have to have an intermediary between himself and them. God wanted to have direct relationship with his people. And it was their rejection of this offer that put Moses in his place and then began to expand what became the Levitical law, as they could no longer have direct communion with God. God had to begin listing out all the things that he expected of them. If we look ahead in this text, we're going to understand better what Jesus is really saying about teaching the law. When we take this one passage out of context and make it say that we have to keep the Ten Commandments, that's what it's teaching, we begin to lose the bigger picture of what Jesus is trying to communicate here. He's trying to teach that the law, while it is still immutable, while it is still valid, while it is still authoritative in our lives, that we have to be careful that we don't fall into the trap of the scribes and Pharisees, where our entire focus becomes on me keeping the law so that I am right, and lose sight of how my application of this objective truth in my life is affecting others around me. Because see, this legalism that seeks righteousness from the keeping of the law is blinded to how our righteousness is damaging people around us. And so that's why you go into this section following this passage where Jesus begins to say, he says 6 different times, you have heard it said, but I say. He says, you have heard it said, do not murder. But I say, don't even be angry. You've heard it said, don't commit adultery. But I say, don't even look at a woman to lust. You've heard it said, you shall not divorce unless you give a certificate. But I say, don't even, there's not even really an excuse for divorce in that way. You've heard it said, don't to swear an oath in this way. But I say to you, just let your yes be yes and your no be no. Just be a simple man of your word. You've heard it said, an eye for an eye. I say, don't resist evil. You've heard it said, hate your enemy. I say, love them instead. You've heard it said that there's this correct behavior, that if you follow this behavior correctly, then you will be acting righteously. But Jesus is saying to us, I want you to pay attention to how your actions affect other people. I want you to be aware of how others are affected. I want you to be aware of what's truly in your heart. This section here is brilliant. At first, he's demonstrating that the teaching of the scribes and the Pharisees has always been deficient. They had missed the point. They were actually relaxing points of the law, which was God-likeness all along, so that they could consider themselves to be righteous. They were losing what was supposed to be a connection to God that would lead us to seek communion with Him, because they had an improper picture of who God was. And many of us still today, we have this wrong picture of who God is. We believe that God's love looks a lot like hate, that if we step out of line, He's just going to slap us back down. And so we treat others like we think God treats us. But even when I talk to some of the most hateful Christians that I know about their experience with God, like you can hear in their stories that they recognize in their story that God was gracious to them, that it was the love of God that drew them out of their lost condition and called them to Him. But somewhere along the way, they had lost sight of how gracious God has been with them and started feeling like they needed to be very firm and rigid and judgmental towards others to get them to do what they believed they needed to do. And this is where all of our ideas about righteousness and perfection break down, because let's be honest, that we think about things we expect people not to do more than we look for the things that we expect people to do. And those things that we typically try to enjoin on people are all external things. We just don't want to see them sinning, right? So we're real focused on the outside of the person, and we're not really lifting up the true core of what it was that Jesus is trying to say, which is that when we follow after him, when we receive the blessing and the gift of the Holy Spirit, he is going to change us from the inside out. And so we have to be aware that while we are seeking after Jesus, while we are longing to follow him in the fullness of our life, we cannot become so focused on conforming our external behaviors that we lose sight of what's really going on in our heart, that we stop caring for others, that we stop being interested in how our righteousness is affecting other people. This is the very truth of what it means to be in the kingdom of God, and we're going to explore this in depth next week. But Jesus goes on in Matthew chapter 5 in verse 20, and he makes this statement that is going to connect us back to what we've been studying for the weeks past and lead us forward into next week's message, which is, "For I tell you, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven." Everyone sitting on that hillside believed that the scribes and Pharisees were the epitome of righteousness. They believed that they were the ones who were getting it right. They were the creme de la creme. No one could do righteousness better than the scribes and the Pharisees. So imagine the emotions that these people would have been feeling to hear that they have to somehow let their righteousness be more, that their righteousness has to exceed that of the scribes and the Pharisees. That would be, I imagine, a pretty disheartening thing to hear. But imagine how the scribes and the Pharisees would have felt. They would have been infuriated. For this teacher, this guy that no one's known, who didn't go through their schools, who they haven't validated, to stand in judgment of them and call their righteousness into question. Doesn't he know who I am? Doesn't he know what I do? Doesn't he know that I keep the Sabbath perfect and I pay my tithe and down to the letter? And how dare he tell me that my actions have not warranted me access into the kingdom of heaven? Doesn't he know that I am the one who defends the true worship of God? Doesn't he know that I'm the one that makes sure that no one disrespects the temple? Doesn't he know that I'm the one who makes sure that we have the right style of worship and the right order of service in our churches? Doesn't he know that I'm the one that's making sure that we are maintaining the righteousness and holiness of all that we do in the worship of God? And you mean to tell me that all of this effort doesn't get me anything? That's exactly what Jesus is saying. Because all of that effort, all of that work that is done by those who seek to have their righteousness affirmed by their actions, by the outward keeping of the law, have not laid hold in truth of what is really necessary for us to truly be righteous before God. There's a book that I've been reading in my devotions called The Imitation of Christ by a man named Thomas à Kempis. And there's this interesting quote that I found in it. It says, "If we let our progress in religious life depend on the observance of its externals alone, our devotion will quickly come to an end." Over and over in our churches, we wonder why it is that we struggle to keep younger people in the church. We wonder why we struggle to grow as a church at all. We wonder why it's so difficult to get people to show up for church, to volunteer, or to participate. And this is why, when we focus on externals, when we make our whole practice of faith about what happens on the outside, our devotion begins to fail because we can't live up to other people's standards and ideas for ourselves. We can't measure up to that. And so what happens is our devotion begins to wane when our only measure for success is that we look right on the outside. When this becomes our primary focus, we start focusing on how people need to quit living in sin. We trot out doctrinal equations and forget that just because the Bible says X and you need to do X, that we forget that it has an impact in people's lives. And so we come out and we stick to our guns and we tell them, 2 + 1 = 3, and we forget that from where they're at, what they're going through in their life, that right now that equation looks a lot more like 1 - 1 = 0. And we lose sight of how what we believe to be the truth about righteousness in their lives isn't taking into account how they are going to be affected by it. We don't treat them, we don't engage with them, we don't respond to them when trying to encourage them to make a change in their life with the perspective that it's not as easy for them in their specific situation to deal with this as it is for us from the outside looking in, just passing judgment on what they need to do. We forget that when we tell someone that they need to stop working on the Sabbath, because it's clear as day, thou shalt not do any work on the Sabbath, that for them and their journey as they're coming to believe this truth and desire to practice this truth, that they are having to process it as if I quit working on Sabbath, I might lose my job. I might not be able to provide for my family. It's not just that simple. Yes, we need to believe God. Yes, we need to follow God. But how many times in your life have you struggled to follow God? That we would not be aware when trying to help someone else along the path that they too are struggling like we did. And apart from the imparted righteousness of Christ, we have no hope. And so just because I have come this far, I can now call them to come that far when both of us are equally dependent upon the righteousness of Christ for our salvation. When we tell someone who's living with their boyfriend or their girlfriend that they need to quit living with their boyfriend or their girlfriend, and to us on the outside, it's very clear that this is not something that God would have us to do. You shouldn't be living with that person if you're not married to them. But for them, coming to confront this truth that they're probably convicted on, that they're wrestling with how to do it, that it's not as simple as just cutting that relationship off. They're having to process what might be the end of a very important relationship in their life. And while God may be calling them to make that decision, while God has set up that there is a better way to live, for us as we are seeking to help each other down this path called Christian life, we have to remember that it's not just about how we look on the outside, but how our actions, what we are calling others to do, how others are responding. We have to be aware of how it's affecting them as well. And we have to support them and help them through these times, not just sit in judgment and tell them, oh, well, you know what you need to be doing. And that's what we do. When someone's struggling with this, we might be gentle at first, but so often we get to this place where it's like, you know what you need to be doing. You just need to do what's right. And we lose sight of the heart of the other person. But God has never lost sight of our heart. God has never forsaken us simply because we weren't moving as quickly as He wanted us to. If that was the case, none of us would be here today. God has extended reckless grace to each and every one of us. We need to learn this lesson, and we need to learn it well. That in the kingdom of heaven, we must be interested in the well-being of those around us, not only on us being right with God. Because the truth is that God has called us to Himself. He came to save the world, and I cannot leave the world behind and go on my own. Oswald Chambers said, the Sermon on the Mount is quite unlike the Ten Commandments in the sense of its principles being unworkable unless Jesus Christ can remake us. To truly live out what it means to be a citizen of the kingdom of heaven goes so far beyond the mere external application of the law. There has to be a complete heart transformation, and this is what Christ is seeking to do in us. He's seeking to conform us fully, heart, soul, and mind and body, to the image of Christ. And nothing short of that can exceed the righteousness of the scribes and the Pharisees. God must impart his righteousness to us and conform us to his image, and it's a work that only he can do. And if we will allow him to do this work, then our lives will be beacons of hope. We will truly be that light that calls all people to God, and the kingdom of heaven will grow. Let us pray. Heavenly Father, Lord, help us to surrender ourselves fully. Lord, I want to be like Jesus. I want you to do this work in me that I cannot do myself. I want you to impart to me the righteousness that is yours and yours alone, because you have fulfilled the law. Help me, Lord, to live completely surrendered to your Spirit. And as I do that, Lord, help me to be an example and a help and a blessing to those who are on this journey with me, just maybe at a different place, struggling with a different thing. Help me, Lord, to be faithful, to live as a citizen of the kingdom of heaven. Amen.